Imagine you owe $1 million and you own the machine that prints money. You'd probably just print the $1 million and call it a day. Now imagine you're a government. You have that machine, you control the currency, you set the rules, and yet you still borrow from banks, from other countries, from ordinary people buying bonds. Why? That question sounds simple. The answer is one of the most carefully hidden mechanics in the entire financial system. And once you understand it, you'll never look at government debt the same way again. Let's start with something uncomfortable. The United States is currently carrying over $34 trillion in debt. The UK, Japan, France, all drowning in numbers that would have seemed fictional 20 years ago. And every year, these governments go back to the market, hat in hand, and borrow more. But these are the same governments that control their own currencies. The Federal Reserve can create dollars. The Bank of England can create pounds. They've done it before, openly, on camera, during the 2008 financial crisis, during COVID, during every major emergency of the last 2 decades. They called it quantitative easing, which is a polite way of saying, we made money appear. So why is there debt at all? Why doesn't the government just print what it needs, spend it, and skip the borrowing entirely? The answer isn't what most people think. It's not laziness. It's not incompetence. It's not even corruption, at least not entirely. It's about control and the consequences of losing it. Here's how money actually works. When a central bank prints money and hands it directly to a government to spend, that money flows into the economy without anything being removed. More money chasing the same amount of goods. That's the definition of inflation. Prices rise, the currency weakens. If you do it too much, too fast, the whole system starts to come apart. Zimbabwe did it. Venezuela did it. Weimar Germany did it so badly that people were burning banknotes for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. So governments learned, or were forced to accept, a rule. You can't just print and spend freely. You need a mechanism that keeps the money supply disciplined, something that makes the creation of money feel earned, or at least credible. Borrowing is that mechanism. When a government issues a bond, it's essentially making a promise. We will give you back this money plus interest at a future date. That promise creates a transaction. Money flows in from investors and the government spends it. The supply of money in circulation doesn't explode overnight because someone had to hand over money first to receive that bond. The system feels balanced, even if it isn't entirely. It's the appearance of discipline. And in economics, the appearance of discipline is almost as important as the real thing. Now here's where it gets interesting. Central banks don't just sit there while governments borrow. They participate. In the last decade, the Federal Reserve bought trillions of dollars of U.S. government bonds. The Bank of Japan owns nearly half of its own country's government debt. The Bank of England did the same during the COVID crisis. When a central bank buys government bonds, it pays for them with newly created money, which means the government is, in a roundabout way, funding itself with printed money, just with extra steps. Steps that make it look more legitimate. Steps that pass the transaction through a market so it doesn't look like the government is just paying its own bills by manufacturing currency. The economist Willem Biter called this the quiet fiscal dominance of monetary policy. Most people have never heard that phrase. Most people were never supposed to. The point is this: the line between printing money and borrowing money is much thinner than governments want you to believe. The borrowing is partly theater. It's a performance of fiscal responsibility staged for bond markets, foreign governments, and the general public, all of whom need to believe the currency is worth something. The moment they stop believing, the game ends. So why does any of this matter right now? Because the math is starting to break. The U.S. government currently spends more on interest payments for its debt than it spends on its entire defense budget. Read that again. More on interest than on the military. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2051, interest payments alone could consume nearly a third of all federal revenue. Japan is already living in the extreme version of this experiment. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is over 260%, the highest of any developed economy on Earth. The Bank of Japan has been buying its own government's bonds for so long, and in such quantities that the bond market barely functions anymore. The government and the central bank have essentially merged into one entity, with the central bank financing whatever the government needs. And somehow, so far, it hasn't collapsed. Inflation remained low for decades, until recently, because the system doesn't break on a schedule. It breaks when confidence breaks, and confidence is the only thing holding any of this together. Here's the part nobody says out loud. Modern governments don't actually need to fully repay their debt. Not in the way you or I would need to repay a loan. They just need to keep rolling it over. Borrow new money to pay back old money. Issue new bonds to retire old bonds. As long as someone keeps buying the bonds, as long as interest rates stay manageable, as long as the economy grows faster than the debt, the machine keeps running. It's not a Ponzi scheme, technically, but it has the same structural dependency. It only works if people keep participating. The moment enough bond buyers decide the risk isn't worth the return, interest rates spike, borrowing costs explode, and governments that seemed perfectly stable start looking very fragile very quickly. This is what happened to Greece in 2010, what happened to Argentina repeatedly, what almost happened to the UK in 2022 when a single reckless budget announcement sent the gilt market into a spiral and forced the Bank of England to intervene within days. The UK nearly had a sovereign debt crisis in 2022, one of the wealthiest, most stable countries on earth. So let's zoom all the way out. Governments borrow instead of print because borrowing looks responsible, because it keeps inflation nominally in check, because it creates a market of creditors, banks, pension funds, foreign governments, who all now have a vested interest in keeping the country solvent. When Japan's government owes money to Japanese pension funds, every retiree in the country becomes a stakeholder in the national debt. That's not an accident. That's architecture. Debt is how governments manufacture buy-in. It's how they tie the fate of the financial system to the fate of the state. And it works until the interest compounds beyond the point of control, until creditors lose faith, until the currency starts to slip, and the government finds itself caught between two impossible choices. Print more money and risk inflation. Borrow more money and deepen the hole. Most governments choose to borrow, every time, because inflation is visible and immediate and politically fatal, while debt is abstract, deferred, and someone else's problem until it isn't. Here's the thought I will leave you with. Every bond your government has ever issued is a promise that future citizens, people who weren't alive when the decision was made, will earn enough and pay enough taxes to honor a debt they never agreed to take on. At some point, every generation inherits the bill. The question nobody in power seems particularly interested in answering is, what happens to the generation that can't pay it?
Please subscribe.